Hey everyone! In this video I'm going to show you some of the basics of using a loop and a flow. I've also provided a link to an unmanaged package that'll get you the config that I'm using in this. What will happen if you click on that is it's going to make you a breweries and beers custom object um, along with some custom fields on the brewery for different types of beer, and on the beers object you'll get a type picklist field with some different values in there. This is going to be a really simple walkthrough, and essentially what we're going to do is count the number of IPAs in a specific brewery based on the type of the beer. And I'll walk you through that in just a second. I'm doing just IPAs to A, keep it simple, and B, give you other things to practice on. But through this, you'll naturally kind of catch on some of the opportunities for enhancement here. But to jump into my flow builder, um, what we're going to end up doing first is building the flow, and then we are going to launch it from Process Builder. I'll also show you how to kick it off from within here for testing purposes as well. But to get started, we need to think about where this is kind of stemming from. And so we're starting from the brewery, and we want to count all of its related bottles. And so we're going to grab this fast lookup element here. I was really confused by the normal elements and the fast elements when I first when I first kind of got into flow. And essentially, if you need to do something with multiple records, you're going to want to get one of these fast lookup, update, create, delete type of elements. If it's just one thing at a time, you're just going to be using the regular elements. But in this sense, since we're going to be getting beers multiple, we're going to use the fast lookup. And so just give it a name. It does a little handy auto-populating of the unique name with the underscore there. And we're going to look up beer. And yeah, in this lookup drop down, it just gives you all of the objects in your Salesforce. And what we want to do is we want to look up records that meet the criteria that we're going to define over here. So in the field, what we're going to do is we're going to type brewery, and we want to get all the beers that equal the brewery that we're starting from. And this is where things start to get kind of conceptual. So we're going to use a variable as this value, because what's ultimately going to happen is we can either kick the flow off from, say, this page and pass in this value here, pass in the records ID. We can kick the flow off from one of the beer's records themselves and pass in the brewery's ID this way. There's a few options, but for now, essentially, we just need a placeholder or a variable, essentially, to stick that value once we've got it. So if you click this drop down, we're going to create a new variable. You may be familiar with this already, and if you are, I would really encourage you to create a variable naming convention that works for yourself. Because the nature of flow, everything is stuck in their own little flow elements and tiles, and so it's really hard to see things. And so if you name something the same way every single time, it'll save you a lot of headache down the road. And so in this example, whenever I make a variable, I call it v underscore whatever I'm looking for, or whatever I'm going to assign to it. So in this case, it's going to be brewery ID. You have some different options with the data type. And as you can see here, you're probably pretty familiar with the kind of typical data types that you'll see in Salesforce. Boolean is true false is just one to point out for you. Input output type, this was another one that I'd never fully got until I really started getting into flow. Essentially, private means you can only use it within this flow itself. Input means that the value of this variable can get assigned from somewhere else. Say if we're on this page and we're going to kick the flow off from here, you can assign the value from this page into the flow and use it, like if we wanted to assign the brewery ID, for instance. Output only is the opposite. So the value exists in the flow and you can pass the value somewhere else. And so these two will be a little confusing at first until you get used to flow. And so essentially, to always be on the safe side, stick it at input and output, because you'll always be able to use the value essentially until you get more used to the nuance types. In all honesty, typically I use input output for 99% of my things as well. So we've got our variable, and so now we're getting all of the beers that have this brewery ID. Uh, Now that we're going to get all of those, we need to put all of those records somewhere. And that's what we do down here in this section. And so we're going to create another variable to hold them for right now. And we're going to make an SObject collection variable. Think of this as just a collection of your beer records. So it could be 10, it could be 100, but just think of like, okay, this is our query. Like say you're in a Salesforce report, this is our query, and now this is the result that came back, and we're just going to put that here for right now. Again, with my naming conventions, I do I do so call underscore whatever it is that I'm going to call it. So this is beers. And the reason why I do so call as opposed to v is because this is an SObject collection variable. COLL is just my shorthand for collection. You can have a collection of just variables as opposed to SObject variables. I won't get into the weeds on the differences between those, but essentially this is just my shorthand for SObject collection, and then that's what I called it. Input, output, and we just define the type of variable. In this case, our object type is beer because we're getting a collection of beers after our query here. Another thing that's important is you specify which of the records fields you want to save in memory. So think of this as, back to the report builder example, we've run this filter and saying, give me all the beers with the brewery equaling the ID that we're going to pass in, but what columns do we want on that report? And that's where you define them here. So we might want the ID, we might want the type, we might want the name. These are just some examples. You can add as many or as few as you want. Something to note is if you ever want to update the records, you need to grab the ID. It's just something that'll catch you later. So that's a quick walkthrough of what a fast lookup element is. Keeping this example really simple, I want to just count IPAs. So I'm actually going to go back into this, and I'm going to edit my criteria here, and I'm going to say that the type equals IPA. You'll notice that when you have pick list values, there's actually a list of your pick list value options that come from Salesforce, so that's kind of handy. Clicking OK. Something that I like to do as I get started with a new flow is just defining the start element if I know where I'm going to start as I go. And you notice how it's an unsaved flow. If I accidentally close this browser window, I'm out of luck. So I save pretty frequently, and so I'm just going to call this IPA counter and save it so that I've got somewhere to go. You'll see these general warnings for a number of reasons throughout your time dabbling in flow, and you just need to look at them each time. And so this is pretty much just saying, hey Brett, you've got one element, and you should connect it to something, although you can run it with one, but I'm just going to bypass that for right now because we're just getting started, so of course we only have one. The next thing I'm going to do is, so we've got all of our beers that are IPAs. I'm going to edit this title just to save me that. I'm just going to call it Get IPAs. Because as I mentioned earlier, flow is very element driven. So all that we have is this little lingo right here. So it's important to write something that will make sense to you later. So I'm then going to grab a loop here, and I'm going to say loop IPAs. And I'm going to loop through. You can type into these boxes to narrow down your options, which becomes really handy when you have a lot of variables. I'm going to loop through all of the beers that we got from our fast lookup. There's an option to do them in either ascending or descending order. In our case, it doesn't matter, so I'm just going to leave it like this. But that does become handy from time to time. And so we need to loop through all of the beers that we got. But as we're looping through them, we need to put the record somewhere to look at it. And this is where we start to get really conceptual, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds to confuse you here. But essentially what we need to do is we need to make an S-object variable to put the beer in while it's going through the loop. So create new S-object variable, and I just do SO beer for my naming convention. SO is S-object. Input output again, and defining the type as a beer. And clicking OK. And so essentially, to back up again, what we have here is we have all of the beers. So we've said, hey, we're starting at Deschutes Brewery. Give me all of the beers that are IPAs. So right now we have Pine Drops, Fresh Squeezed, and Inversion. And so these three records are in our SO collection beers. And as we're looping through them, one at a time, Pine Drops is going to get assigned to the SO beer variable. When the loop's done with Pine Drops, it's then going to assign the next one here. So just keep that in mind as we're rolling through this. So I click OK. We've now got our loop element. Let's connect these up. So we go from the fast lookup into the loop. Our next step is we're going to grab one of these assignment little assignment widgets over here, and name this something that will make sense to you when you're looking at it from that major screen. And so what I'm going to call this is increment counter, because all that we want, this is going to be a really simple flow. It's just going to count the number of variables that kind of pass through it. You can do a lot more fancy things, and I'll get into those with future videos and examples. But for right now, all we want to do is count the number that goes through. So the thing to keep in mind is, where is that count going to go? So of course, we're going to need a variable for that. Here's something to help you save yourself some clicks as you're creating new variables. You can click the drop down and click the create new and go into it. But so I'm going to tab into this. I'm going to push the down arrow, and that's going to open it. I'm going to push right, down, enter. Once you've done that 1,000 times, you will create variables in like half a second instead of reaching for your mouse and spending the extra bit of time each time. So again, this is just a variable, so I'm using my naming convention v underscore, and then it's called counter. The data type of this is a number, and it's a 0. Technically, it's private because it's not ever going to get passed in or out of the flow. Just out of a habit in my muscle memory, I'll tend to keep it input and output, and I'll just leave it like that to keep the example simple. This is something to keep in, that's important for this particular example, is the default of this needs to be 0. And the reason for that is each time that this goes through the flow, we're going to add 1 to it. And if you try to add 1 to null, which is what this would be if we never assigned it a default value and we didn't assign it a value throughout the flow, you're going to get a nice ugly error message. So if you're ever using counters in flow, just remember to assign a default before you get started, and you'll be good to go. So we now have our counter that is 0, and in this operator section, you can make this counter equal to something, add to it, or subtract from it. So we're going to add 1 each time. Click OK. We're going to loop IPAs. As you notice, when you drag that element here, it gives you some options. And so when we're going to go to the assignment, we're going to go every single time that we're in the collection, which is the default option for you. we'll be using the second option in just a second when the loop finishes. So for each value in the collection, we're going to go over here to the counter. Since we've just incremented it, we're just going to go right back. So we've got all of our IPAs. We've got these three: pine drops, fresh squeeze, inversion. Loop number 1, pine drops, it's going to go over count. 0 plus 1 is 1. Now 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus 1 is 3. So that's essentially what's going to happen here. And then now we are going to do a regular record update, because we're only going to be updating one brewery record. So update brewery. And so again, we have similar options that we had in that fast lookup. So we first need to define what brewery it is that we're going to update. Lucky us, since we're going to most likely be coming from a records page itself, we'll have things like the record ID to just search off of, so it makes it really, really easy. So we can just say that we want to update the brewery with the record ID of v_brewery ID. And what are we going to update? We're going to update IPAs with our counter. And from there, we're going to drag our loop down. The end of the loop will just end up right here. So we save this, no errors, we're in good shape. Now you might be thinking, oh Brett, I want to test this out. How do I do that? There's a number of ways that you can do it. The quickest way is go to the Explorer, go to any test record that you'd want to use, double click up here in the URL. Now this is just a 15-character Salesforce ID. There's a 15-character and an 18-character. You typically want to use the 18-character. What I'm doing here is not a best practice, but it'll get you by for testing flows. But if you're ever actually using IDs in DML, like updates and creates and all of that fun stuff, you should actually go get the real 18-character ID. But just to take a shortcut, I'm just going to I copied that over there. I'm going to go into my brewery ID variable, and I'm going to set this as a default to that value, so that essentially when this flow starts, it's going to start at Deschutes Brewery. And so if we save this, and now if we click run, it's going to give us a pop-up. It's going to say your flow finished. And if we refresh this page, we do indeed have 3 IPAs. So that was a really simple walkthrough of using a flow in a loop. I'm going to put together some other videos on how to launch a flow from Process Builder and launch a flow from a custom button that uses a Visualforce page. After those examples, I'm going to do an example of how to really optimize this, where you can use the same logic in a flow across multiple flows. Because if you look closely at what we're doing here, all that we're doing is we're looping beers based on a type. And so thinking down the road, we're probably going to want to count all 5 different types eventually. So what we don't want to have to do is copy and paste all of this stuff 5 times. It would be fine to do theoretically, but if you ever need to change any of that, you now have to change it in 5 places, which is a nightmare. You don't want to do that. So look out for those coming up shortly. But yeah, again, and play around with this, play around with looping and doing different criteria, and make an example of your own. And yeah, feel free to reach out for me if you get stuck or you have other questions. Thanks for watching.